Welcome to the Filmmakers Live. This is our podcast where we speak to filmmakers who have already built a career in filmmaking. And most of the people who find me are filmmakers who are looking to get their careers going, get their films made. And I specialize in the business side of things, fundraising and money and all of that stuff. So we'll get to all of that, but this podcast is really gives filmmakers the chance to see how somebody who's further along has actually made all of that happen. And one of the things that I've learned from doing this podcast is there's no such thing as the same path for any two filmmakers. That's not the case. It's like there's no such thing as the cookie cutter approach. So today I am delighted to introduce you to Richard Fung, who I met several years ago at the Trinidad and Tobago Film Festival. I don't know if you remember, Richard. We had breakfast
Absolutely, at the Hilton.
At the Hilton. And so it's been a few years that I've been wanting to have you on my podcast. So I don't do an introduction because I like to start way at the beginning. And my first question always is, when did you first know you were a filmmaker?
Oh, that took a long time. Well, first of all, I mean, filmmaker is something that I can sometimes now call myself because, there's no such thing as celluloid anymore or video, but I actually started out as a video artist. I was at art school. I wanted to be an architect all my life, but I was terrible at math. And then, so I ended up in art school trying to do industrial design, and that didn't satisfy me. And then I just happened to come across the film classes. And so I started to attend the cinema studies classes, really.
Right.
Started.
It was like, oh, a class I'm not going to fail.
Looking at French films, etc., and Japanese film. And so then I started studying video. So I worked at the beginning, when you finish university or secondary, like post-secondary school, you don't quite know what to do. And I got a job by chance working in community television. And that was a brief moment in Canada where, because Canada was a pioneer in cable TV, because the country is so vast, right? That was it was pioneered here, and the government had mandated 10% of that income from the companies to go into community television production. So I worked with a public housing community that had received bad press for violence, etc. And my job was to train community members to make videos about themselves that we then posted on the cable channels.
Nice. Now, before we keep going, and this is going to happen, Richard, because it always happens when I'm interviewing someone. I'm always like, wait, let's just go back a minute.
Yeah.
So when you were taking those cinema studies classes and you said French, Japanese, I was like, oh, I started out exactly that way. I started out studying, French films, Japanese films, but it was really art with a capital A films that I started out in. I started out in kind of art and experimental. And I wonder if that was where because I feel as though that was what naturally film was for me because of where I started looking at film. Was that the case for you?
Well, yes, because I was in an art school, right? So I was
Right.
also surrounded by
Yes.
cinemas, and that's where I ended up teaching many, many decades later. I'm now
Ah.
retired from. But yes, and then what happened with me is, okay, so it's a bit complicated. I started out in University of Toronto in geography, actually, and then I switched to art school, but I actually attended both institutions at the same time. And then I eventually ended up graduating from art school and the University of Toronto in cinema studies and Spanish.
Wow.
So
It makes so much sense when this is why I always ask this question, because as I see your work down the road, the roots of it are here, right? The roots I can see how, and then even the mixture of art with a capital A and the public housing story. I see all of that in your work.
Yeah, I mean, and the work has drifted around, right, in terms of the emphasis and the kind of form that it takes.
Yes, but it's still all there, even the geography.
Well, actually, geography, I realized some years ago that all of my work, whether it's experimental or documentary, has at its core people, or in one case, a bread, roti, moving through geopolitical space, right? I mean, I think that's what they all have in common.
Ah, that's really nice. And I just want to express some real annoyance that I am on a fast and we're going to be talking about roti. So I just want to say that up front. That's going to be hard for me, but that's where I'm at. I wonder if it would be okay with you if we show the trailer that Emily has lined up for us, because I think it's going to be a nice way to look at your early work and later work. Emily, go ahead. I might have surprised her. That's so early. She's like, what? This is the trailer for Reorientations. Think the sound, yes.
I didn't link the sound. 1 second. As I clicked it, I said, wait, I didn't get that check mark because they moved it on me.
I didn't even know there was a community. I didn't have any idea. All I knew of the homosexual community was St. Charles Tavern.
Over 30 years have passed since I recorded Lloyd in Toronto's Chinatown. He was one of 14 people who appeared in my documentary Orientations, Lesbian and Gay Asians.
I remember my supervisor saying to me, it's okay for you to be gay, but you don't have to tell anybody about it. And I said, what's that mean? Don't tell anybody about it,
My mother is Chinese. She's from Shanghai. My father is from Melbourne, Australia.
I'm not really sure what I was thinking when I said what I said 30 years ago.
They assume that I'm passive, which I'm not.
It feels like I wasn't being honest.
It was sort of like my first time, and I didn't really know what the word lesbian was.
3 decades later, I recontact the participants.
It's over 120 this year.
I'm curious to see how we've changed, how the world has changed. Of the original 14, 3 have died. 7 have agreed to return.
Beautiful, beautiful. So I'm not sure that was, I think you were at earlier than 30 years ago, so I hope I didn't throw you off, but I'm really glad. It's always so difficult on Zoom to actually show anything, but it was nice to be able to have that trailer. So let's take it from where you were at. You were making, I love the idea of having people tell their own stories. But that was a long time ago. How long ago was that you had the public housing project? Okay, so yeah, I mean, I think that and this idea of democracy and media and people telling their own stories, and I don't use the term giving voice because I think people have voice, but what people don't have is a way to get that voice heard often, right? And so that idea has really stuck with me. And so Orientations, Lesbian and Gay Asians, which was the first video that I did as an independent maker, was done in 1984. And it came out of my work organizing
Gay Asians Toronto, which was started in 1980, which was the first organizations for what we now call LGBTQ people, people of color in Canada.
Ah,
And it came out of a movement. I attended the first, what was it called? Gay Rights March in Washington in 1979 with Tony Souza, whom you see, who, by the way, was right-hand man to Mother Teresa in Calcutta
really?
in his younger days. Yeah, that came from a very particular kind of moment very early on in the movement. And so that I did that video. I did not intend to be a filmmaker, but I was curating. I was hired to program the first anti-racism film festival in Toronto that year, 1984.
Uh-huh.
By a film company, and then they asked me what I was doing, and I said, I'm doing this
But
set of
how did
interviews.
that happen? How did how did it happen that you would get to be asked to program a film festival, you know?
Well, there weren't a lot of non-white folks. I mean, the demographics of Canada and Toronto have changed enormously since I first arrived here, right?
Yes,
In
yes.
1973. I'm
Uh-huh.
now one of the most multicultural cities in the world, but you know, in
Yes.
1970s, it was still vastly a white city.
Mhm.
And so yeah, so I was programming this festival, and the
But it
organization.
came out of your organizing work, is that right?
Yeah, because I'd long been involved. My first
Yes.
activism in Toronto was really around apartheid. Well, even before that, so it was the Toronto Committee for the Liberation of Southern Africa, which both Prabha and Tony were involved in at
Uh-huh.
various points as well. But that was the point where the struggle was around, you know, Mozambique and Angola, etc. And then it got whittled down to South Africa being the last,
Right.
you know, the
Yes.
last holdout. And so I think maybe that was it. But you know, in various solidarity movements, because I really have thought of myself as a kind of international subject or a global subject. You know, growing up Trinidadian and the intimacies of those four continents, as Lisa Lowe has said, it really puts you, I don't know, a feeling of being connected to everyone. Also, my family is very,
Oh,
you know, very
yes.
Trinidadian in that way. I always say my first cousins on my father was born in China.
Uh-huh.
On my mother's side, I'm descended from indentured workers from
Uh-huh.
my great grandparents arrived in 1862.
Mm.
And all of my first cousins are mixed race, right? So they're mixed race, half Indian, half Black, half Portuguese, or half white American, which has to do with the
Love that.
Americans having a
Well,
base in Trinidad in the Second World War, right?
way too many halves, but great.
Well, yeah, and then everybody else is all like multiply mixed again.
I feel as though, I mean, I grew up in London, which is, you know, one of the most multicultural cities in the
Yes.
world. But, you know, I always think of myself as an international person, and I grew up thinking of myself that way. And I think it comes, even though I think English people are that way, but it's really from the Trinidadian side.
Yes.
And so, you know, I went to school with English people who I thought were very kind of sad, you know, and boring. And then, but my home life was all Trinidadian.
Yeah.
You know, every weekend, every holiday, everybody, it was all Trinidadian. And, you know, that was where all the life was and all the richness was, and the roti, for sure. But I think, you know, we as Trinidadians, as well, you know, I tell people that the national food of Trinidad is callaloo. The whole idea is that you take these ingredients that don't seem to have any connection, and you put them together, and they make this absolutely wonderful flavor. And, you know, it's just a certain way that we think about things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know? And with the Chinese and the thing, to me, that's fascinating. It's wonderful. Absolutely.
I think that's what attracts all these anthropologists to Trinidad. It's like
really?
it's an anthropology bait.
Melting pot, yes, yes. Oh, that's, yeah, because Jeffrey Holder, I just saw his name reading about one of your films. But yes, I've wondered about the anthropology thing with Trinidad.
Well, yeah, because it's so fascinating. I mean, all the layers in that tiny little country, including many things that people don't know about. I mean, the migrations. One of the food things is, I don't know if you know about the recent discovery of Maruga rice.
Oh, no.
So Maruga rice is a dry rice. It was recently discovered. I think we discovered. They always knew they had it. They were growing it, but it was rediscovered by people from the Smithsonian. I think African American chefs rediscovered. But its story is it's an African rice that existed in the States and then was brought to Trinidad by the loyalists, who are known in Trinidad as Americans. And I don't know if you know the story, but
No.
so the Black soldiers who fought with the British were given land in the south of Trinidad, and they maintained their own cultures. And they're called Americans without the A.
Right.
And my mother is from that area, and she would talk about these villages called Fifth Company, Sixth Company, and they actually the villages are called after the companies. And so they're and so it's an area that is known for a very specific culture. Famous for stick fighting, etc. And they found this rice, which is now being marketed somewhat. It was taken back to the States from Trinidad and then regrown there. But it's yes, it's one of those fascinating stories that has recently come out. I think in the last 10 years that Maruga rice was kind of rediscovered.
Wow. Yeah, one of my discoveries in Trinidad is that Trinitario beans, cocoa beans, are considered the #1 cocoa bean in the world.
And it has a cocoa dispensary, the repository with all the beans from around the world.
Yes, and it's just like this tiny little place. So when you started, when you started making before that, programming the festival, programming the anti-racism festival, and you still didn't think of yourself as a filmmaker.
No, I mean, that video was done as a kind of consciousness raising tool. And then as I said, I was hired by it was called Development Education Center. It was a huge enterprise with a radio station, radio programs, and book publishing, which still exists, and a film distribution company. I ended up working there, and we had the largest collection of documentary and third world film in Canada. And so they said they wanted to know what I was working on, and I showed them the video, and then it was then shown at the Grierson seminars, and then someone at the Grierson seminars somehow picked it up, and it was invited to the Flaherty seminars in the States, which brings together a lot of film programmers and critics, and that's how I became a filmmaker by accident.
Right, you backed into it.
I was invited, I went, and then I met other filmmakers, and then I made another video, and then and that's the way it unfolded.
The activism was really the motivation for that first piece, Orientations, and it's people of color, gay and lesbian, and another side of activism. I think that was when I came to America, and we started a cinema here in Miami Beach, and after a very strange start, we started to program gay and lesbian cinema here. And it was the first time in Miami that there was any LGBT art at all. There had never been anything cultural for the community here in Miami. So it was a first. And we always, for the next 10 years that we had our cinema, we had such huge support from the LGBT community, because people would arrive in Miami from Canada and they would come straight to the cinema, say, oh, I was told to come here to find out what was going on.
Amazing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So now that you're in the Flaherty seminar and the Grierson seminar, what did you decide to do next? Once you started to realize you were a filmmaker?
Well, so then I did a short experimental piece called Chinese Characters that was about gay Asian spectatorship and pornography, right? I was just come out of film school. I was really influenced by a lot of people. One of my professors was one of the major programmers for the Toronto what became the Toronto International Film Festival. It had a
Right.
different name then. And that was very widely picked up and shown internationally. It was shown at the American Film Institute and like widely in Europe, etc. And then I realized, okay, I don't want to become the gay-Asian video maker. So then I decided to make work on my family. My parents. I did first a video on my father, who was from China, and somehow China, which was exactly on the opposite side of the world from me in Trinidad, I'd never been. It was very exotic to me, but somehow they were like puppet strings that came from across the world. People attached me to China. You know, my family is very Creolized. My mother's family is very Creolized. So it was about that fascination with my father and the, fatherland. And I went to China in 1986 for the first time with my mother. It was both of our first trips to China, and it was about thinking about China from the West and from diaspora. Really, it was about a diasporic connection to a homeland or a fatherland in that case. Then I did a video with my mother, which is called My Mother's Place, because it was looking at my mother, who was third generation Trinidadian from Moruga, it's like in the bush in Trinidad.
Right,
It's as
in the
far away
bush.
from Port of Spain as you can get, probably.
Yes.
And so this question of identity of race and gender and class, right? Thinking about all these points of identity across I think, a dividing line for us, because my mother was born in 1909. I was an old people's child in Trinidad.
Right.
Yeah, you know that term, lanyard, the leftover. And I grew up at the point of independence when Trinidad really realigned itself from a kind of focus to London,
Yes.
right? To thinking of itself as a part of this other post-colonial world. So, when I was very small, the guests would be Princess this or Princess that, right? Princess Royal, Princess Anne, Princess Alice. I remember the names. And then after independence in 1962, it was, Haile Selassie, Senghor, Indira Gandhi, thinking of a different kind of relationship to the world. And I think those, with my mother, I was looking at the arguments that we had and how it had to do with a different education. But one of the things my mother reflects on in that video is growing up in Moruga, right? So it's you're on the bottom of an island looking into the delta of the Orinoco in Venezuela. She says, I was taught to recite all of the bays and towns of England and Scotland, right? That was a colonial education. Right. And so then she laughs and says, that didn't make sense. But again, forcing her to reflect on her own, if I can say, colonization. And
indoctrination.
I'm not sure I'm completely free of colonizing the colonizing education either, because even though I grew up in the post-colonial era, I was struck going back to Trinidad how long it took for the textbooks to change. Or
I remember back then when I was a child getting Christmas cards from Trinidad with snow in them and Christmas.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, there was a recipe in Trinidad when I was a kid. There was somebody who was responsible for bringing Christmas trees to Trinidad. Actually, somebody who had been in Canada, like real Christmas trees,
right?
Canadian Christmas trees. And then there was a recipe for whipping Lux flakes. I don't know if you old enough to remember Lux flakes.
Oh yeah,
it was a kind of detergent, but it was in soap flakes.
Yes.
And you whip it up,
Yes.
And if you whipped it up hard enough and you put it on the tree, it actually solidified and looked exactly like snow, but smelled like soap. So my memory of Trinidad is smelling the fir trees, the pine trees that would smell very strong because they were in tropical heat, mixed with the smell of Lux soap.
So I remember I was 15 when I first went to Trinidad, and I was very surprised in my 15-year-old way to discover that I couldn't buy any Trinidadian souvenirs.
Oh,
There was nothing Trinidadian to buy.
yeah.
And it wasn't until years later when there was a big shift in the thinking, I guess, from the government, and they started to impose huge taxes on things to be imported, that suddenly all the art of Trinidad is now available, you know, bracelets and jewelry and food is all available. But when I first went there, I was like, there's nothing Trinidadian here.
The depth of colonization in these
Yes.
countries is pretty amazing. I mean, I
Yes.
had dinner with 2 Trinidadian writers of my generation a couple of nights ago, and I served dessert. I hold a pan-Caribbean potluck, and one of my friends, Trinidadian artist, brought over sorrel ice cream that she had made, like
Wow.
personally, and I served it in these little green depression glass bowls that I had, which my mother had acquired one by one when she was working as a shop girl at Woolworths in the 1920s. So they really are depression glass.
Yes.
And I was saying that when I was a kid, we would have Jello or and fruit cocktail.
Yes.
So, mangoes were not considered appropriate to serve to guests.
Right.
Like tropical fruit would not, you had to have imported canned fruit cocktail.
Canned fruit.
Yeah, to serve to guests.
When I was growing up in the 60s, my mother, apparently, I was told this, my mother couldn't cook before she got married, and my godmother taught her to cook. So she only knew how to cook Trinidadian food, And so the only time that we had anything that wasn't like rice and peas and, it was out of a can.
Well, no, I mean, and one of the people that a Guyanese person brought, he made bake, which you wouldn't know, which is he made fry bake, which sounds like an oxymoron.
Yes.
But he brought a Guyanese dish, which I'd never had, which is canned corned beef with what was it, with potatoes. But the idea of these canned corned beef, which I think has roots in the Second World War, but was widely used in Trinidad, all these canned food products that we have.
I just made a cat corned beef thing just to feel my mother.
So all the different Caribbean people were all talking about all the different versions of canned corned beef that we had. In my house, it was canned corned beef and rice with canned peas.
And canned tomatoes.
We didn't have canned tomatoes, thank goodness, I guess, because my mother did have tomatoes in the backyard.
Oh.
But
well, we should go back to film, but it's so fun to talk about food. So where in the story, and because this is just my work, I focus on money and earning money, raising money, focusing on the business and all of that. When did you feel that you started to earn a living as a filmmaker, and how did you do that?
Well, I'm not sure if I've ever learned my living as a filmmaker, because the producer reports are not big enough to be to do that. But when I was starting out, my friend John Grayson, who became quite well known, and his work has been, he's won lots of international prizes for his work. He said, we have to actually create our own discourse. So very early on, I was involved in film distribution, writing about film exhibitions. So I co-founded a festival, and then I have been programming and writing about film. So the whole ecosystem, and then I was involved in doing equity work, anti-racism equity work at the Canada Council, which is it's the equivalent of the NEA, but much more important. In fact, the NEA was modeled on the Canada Council. But we have a very crucial difference at the Canada Council, which is peer review. And I remember I sat on an NEA jury once, and I was told it's not a jury, it's an adjudication committee. And the committee recommends work. So in Canada, the difference is that the jury actually of peers of artists make the final decision, and bureaucrats and politicians are not allowed to overturn those decisions. So what it means is that while I remember the period when there were lots of controversy at the NEA over Andres Serrano and Robert Mapplethorpe, etc., that kind of thing didn't happen here. Partly because of a different political context, but also partly because of the fact that no one has ever tried to overturn those. Now we are facing a fall of the Liberal government and voting in of a conservative government, and this guy has his eye on killing the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, as well as, I think, the Canada Council.
Yeah, we had that in England as well. Mrs. Thatcher tried to defund the BBC, and because I can't think like a conservative, I don't really get it, but there always seems to be this desire to suppress freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom of expression. I'm not quite sure why, but it seems to go hand in hand. So yeah, and I remember you telling me about some changes that have happened in Canada, where even at, I think, like a governmental level, that they're now always, I'm probably saying it all wrong, but there needs to be a representation of Native Americans, Native Canadians on boards and things like that. I think I remember you telling me something like that.
Well, I mean, this has been the striking thing also about the conversations in Canada that's different to the United States is that Indigenous Canadians have been much more present at the forefront of things. And so we've gone through a kind of Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and so on the one, I mean, it's an unstable thing, right? So on the one hand, people have been held accountable to the treaties, right? Because they've broken a lot of the treaties. But Indigenous artists are now at the forefront of cinema and contemporary art in Canada. But that's very fragile. I mean, the Art Gallery of Ontario, which would be the second largest art museum in the country, basically fired their first Indigenous focus curator. There have been Indigenous curators before, but she was like the first, and she built all these things, which of course it's like nation to nation relations now, the way that we think about it, over a post on Palestine, right?
Okay.
As an as an Indigenous woman talking about genocide. And so that's been a huge case, and you see how fragile it is. And they actually took down the signage at the museum that was talking about the Indigenous relations, because of course they've now broken relations with the nations with whom they have set up relations. So it's a very serious thing. But yeah, I guess like New Zealand, I guess we're closer to places like New Zealand and Australia. Well, New Zealand particularly, I think, in relation to the way that the state the colonial state has tried to repair relations with Indigenous people and Indigenous nations here. Very much quite different to the United States, I think.
Yes, it is very fragile. So if somebody were to pick, were only able to watch one of your films, which film would you want them to pick?
Well, I mean, that's hard because it is so they're all so different, right? And the focus is also different. Probably the one that I think, a recent film that gives people the most joy is Dal Puri Diaspora, which you've made reference to. So it's
Yes.
a documentary that retraces Indian migrant workers from India starting in 1845 to the Caribbean, also to Mauritius and Fiji and Southern Africa. And then that migration coming to Canada in the 60s with the removal of an all-white immigration policy. So it looks at the morphing of the recipe for dal puri, which originates
You
in
have to explain just for a minute. You just
oh
have to
right.
explain what is dal puri and what
Okay.
is dal puri diaspora.
Okay.
That's great.
So dal puri is a flat bread, and in its original state, a kind of fritter almost. Puris in India are fried breads, usually.
Right.
It refers
They
to a kind of
blow up.
fried bread. Yeah.
Right.
But a dal puri in its original context in Bhojpuri, in the Bhojpur area of India, in eastern North India, it's actually, you wouldn't recognize it from what it's become today. It's a
Oh,
little fritter made of semolina flour. It's stuffed with dal, which is
right.
peas, dried lentils. And in the Indian context, it's only used in festivals and feast
Oh,
days,
oh,
celebrations. It's never sold on the street. It's never
oh,
sold in restaurants. It's
oh,
often eaten with sweet rice pudding.
wow.
So that recipe, which you can also find in Calcutta, goes to the Caribbean, where it's made in the conditions of the plantation of indentured workers. So they're
Mhm.
importing white flour, all wheat,
Mhm.
all-purpose flour. So it
Yes.
becomes soft, it
Mhm.
becomes bigger,
Mhm.
and then later on it becomes in Trinidad, it's wrapped like a burrito.
Mhm.
And it becomes a kind of national food, and then it travels to places like London, Miami, Toronto, New York, very much in New York, with
Yes.
migrants from the Southern Caribbean. But
When
it
I
also
was,
goes to Suriname and goes to the Netherlands that way, right? So you can find it in
oh,
Amsterdam, the
really?
Surinamese version in Amsterdam. I've eaten Mauritian dal puri in Paris, right? Because in what is interesting is, as I said, in its home area, it's very private, very special. But
Uh-huh.
in Mauritius and in the Southern Caribbean, it became street food and the defining Indian food in those areas. And then
Wow.
in Canada, in Toronto, it's other than jerk pork, which is Jamaican,
Right.
it's become the defining Caribbean food because
Right.
all the Trinidad and Guyanese restaurants, it's roti shops.
Yes. When I was a child, roti was a very special occasion thing.
Yes.
And certainly there was no way you could buy it. But so I remember the parties, and it's all ages, right? At the parties, from grandma to the kids, everybody's together. And then there would always be a table set out, and somebody or two people were making dal puri, and I would watch them because I still love to cook. And that white flour and in a bowl, and then I would watch them push their thumb in and put the peas in and close up the peas. And still to this day,
Yeah.
I do not understand how you roll that out and the flour is on the outside and the peas are on the inside. I don't
It's a
understand.
skill. It's a skill that it takes. I can't make that kind of roti because roti is a generic name for bread in
True.
India.
Yes,
Like
true. Dal
even
puri. Mhm.
even white bread is called double roti in India.
Oh,
But rotis, naans, parathas, all these
yes.
chapatis
Yes.
that people would
Right.
probably know.
That's right.
But so
Mhm.
yeah, dal puri is a very particular one.
Yes.
And it's a skill. I make sada roti, which is a bread that was a home bread that Indo-Trinidadians make and is eaten usually for breakfast or for dinner.
Breakfast.
And it's now just hitting the roti shops. It was never
Oh,
commercialized until
right.
it's beginning to become commercialized as Trinidadians become more curious. I mean, non-Indo-Trinidadians about everybody's food.
Uh-huh.
And the food you know, and people keep experimenting even with things like roti or doubles, which really is now the Trinidadian obsession, which also has Indian roots, which is two, how do I describe them? Two fritters with curry chickpeas in the middle. And it's
Yes,
doubled, which is why it's
yes.
called doubles. And doubles is a
deep fry.
singular verb, right? So a doubles. I want a doubles.
It doubles. The doubles.
Like a currants roll.
Currants roll. That's right. That's right.
Otherwise known as fly cemetery.
There was nothing that was made with flour that my father didn't like. So
Oh,
I know all of these things. I can't eat flour anymore, but you know, roti is just one of the most fabulous. Dal puri is one of the most fabulous things, and that magic of being able to roll that thing out with the peas, that's a miraculous skill, really. So your film, it's showing that journey that you described into the Caribbean and then out of the Caribbean, and you know, that's amazing. And I can't eat it anymore, but still, anytime I see a roti shop, I'm happy. Here in Miami, you know.
Yes.
Okay, so our recommendation is to see Dalpuri Diaspora, and you'll learn a whole lot about Trinidad, and you'll learn a whole lot about our food.
The film I made after that, or two ones that I made after that, which actually is surprisingly showing in Dublin in a couple of weeks in a festival there, is a film I made with my cousin Nang. It's called Nang by Nang.
Oh, yes.
I call it Nang by Nang because it's really her version of her life.
Mm-hmm.
And I made that film for a couple of reasons. One is because Nang's story is so in itself fascinating,
Right.
but also because, you know, I grew up in a Catholic family in Trinidad, and in a kind of Trinidad, it's a kind of a place with two minds, you know, like on the one hand, a very conservative veneer, but the other hand, what people are doing within that conservatism is very out there, right?
Oh.
So Mike Nang, who died at the age of 94, in outside of Albuquerque, was what in Trinidad would be said would be my outside cousin. So she was born to my oldest uncle. They were not married. So we all have inside and outside relatives.
Inside and outside, that's right.
Yeah. So her mother was Black and Carib, and she was actually living in the house with my grandparents. And my mother was kind of raising her so my family also was like that, with inside and outside children, and kind of extended, and everybody kind of living together.
Mm-hmm.
And then in her account, her mother came and she sometimes said her mother stole her from my family, right? So she had a very unhappy childhood with her mother, but her life, she was a survivor. Okay, so Nang had 5 husbands. And they were all quite amazing. Like her life, I didn't even know where to start. So she was very beautiful. She looked a bit like Eartha Kitt, if I can give you an example of what she looked like.
I saw a picture of her. She is stunning.
So she was even in her 90s.
Yes.
And so she was working as a shop girl in a department store in Trinidad, in Port of Spain, and then Bosco Holder, who was a painter, came and asked her to pose for him. And when she went there, she met Jeffrey Holder, who Americans would know because he won Tony Awards for The Wiz, which he designed, right, and directed. And he was also in James Bond films, very famous for advertising the Uncola. When I arrived in Canada, he was doing the ads for the Uncola, 7-Up, the Uncola. And so she was Bosco's dance partner. And before he died, I managed to contact him and send him the photographs that he had taken of her in the 40s, because she was his first photographic muse. And again, she did all these amazing pictures. So one of them is of Nang, like topless with daisies on her breasts, on her nipples, right? And so again, this is this conservative Trinidad in which this was happening in the 40s. Bosco went to London, where he had a show on the BBC, and he was credited for introducing steel band music to London. Like he performed at the coronation, I think, or at the Queen's wedding or something. So the two brothers were very important in Trinidad, in that kind of international in Trinidad. And so that was Nang's story. And you know, her life story as a survivor was amazing. She went back to school. She went to university in her 50s, I think. She arrived in the States. She worked as a domestic at one point because that was the only way she could be there. But yeah, so she was a survivor, and I think looking at choices for women in that period. I mean, one of the things she said, okay, so at one point she went off to Venezuela, and worked in the Orinoco in a company as a secretary or something. And then she comes back and she said, that's when I came back and bought my first house. Because in Trinidad, only people with property could vote. You had to have property in order to be.
How long ago was that?
I don't know, it would have been in the
Oh, wow.
50s, maybe,
Right.
40s or 50s.
Yes.
And so one of the things, I guess, that drives my work, or one strand of my work, is looking at that history that many of us don't know.
Right.
And looking at these kind of subaltern stories that often aren't celebrated. I also wanted to make a work on Nang because I've been involved in kind of Asian Canadian movements. I'm actually organizing a symposium for next year on Asian Canadian studies, on Chinese Caribbean studies. Because the story of the Chinese in the Caribbean is so unlike that of North America, right? And if you're talking about Chinese in the Caribbean context, you have to talk about mixed race, right? Because that's who the Chinese community is. At the Caribbean potluck was my cousin Adam, who did the animation for my latest film, and his grandfather was my second cousin, but is my second cousin, but he's also on his grandmother's side was Indian and Chinese and Carib, and one of his grandmothers is Lebanese, who arrived in Trinidad from London, where she only cooked British food, apparently, right? And so, you know, like, it is that kind of rephrasing of Chineseness in a very inauthentic, impure way that is its expression in the Caribbean. And I think that is something that we're trying to kind of think about, and we're also reimagining the Caribbean. It's fractured across the regions, because the thing that, you know, if you say Caribbean in Toronto, people think Jamaica, Trinidad, Guyana, which is not even in the Caribbean. Really, technically, it's part of South America. It's not in the Caribbean Sea. You know, Antigua, Barbados, St. Kitts, Nevis, etc. But there's also the French Caribbean, which is, you know, Martinique, Guadeloupe, etc., which are part of France. The overseas departments in there, as France as Paris is.
French is.
And they don't have connections with the islands next to them because they can't trade, right? There's Haiti, the first independent country of the Americas, which is Creolophone. And then we're also looking at, you know, the Spanish-speaking territories, and looking at the basin, because if you look at a country like Costa Rica, I remember being in Costa Rica and going to the Caribbean coast, places like Limon, which is actually settled by Jamaicans. People speak English with a Jamaican accent, and pointing at something which I know as guisada, which is a Jamaican coconut tart. And people saying to me, that is so interesting that you call it that. Only old people call it that. We call it cocada, which means, you know, it's like a coconut sweet, right? Because it's also, they're beginning to become more and more Hispanic, more and more Hispanophone. And so those combinations, you know, San Andres in Colombia is also settled by Jamaicans. There's a movement of Caribbean people across that whole range. Trinidadians, my great uncle died in Panama, went to work on the canal. people went from Trinidad to work on the oil fields of Venezuela. So there've actually been all these movements in the rim as well. So we're inviting people from Costa Rica, from Panama. So
Are,
yeah, so
are,
we're breaking down those
are
linguistic
other
barriers.
Caribbean people other than Trinidadians, are other Caribbean people such travelers as Trinidadians are?
Jamaicans for sure. I mean, as I was saying,
Jamaicans,
you know, the
yes.
coast, also the coast of Nicaragua. If you go
Yes,
there,
right.
English with a Jamaican accent, San
Mhm.
Andres, all the way up. I
Yes.
think Livingston also. I've never been to Livingston. I've been to those other places, which is in Guatemala. Just the name Livingston tells you something, right?
Yes, yes. I saw
And
a
then
play years ago, 20 years ago, maybe longer, in Miami, that came from the coast of Nicaragua. It's in English, but it was Garifuna people.
Garifuna. Well, and those, of course, people from St. Vincent, indigenous people, Caribs who were deported for being troublemakers, and from St. Vincent to Belize, right? So there've been
Yes.
all of this movement. So in my
Yeah.
Caribbean potluck last year, he didn't come this year, but one of my co-organizers is a fabulous filmmaker that you should interview,
Yes.
is Raymond Desir, who is from Haiti.
Okay. Okay.
So he's been bringing these Haitian dishes, which fascinate me because Haiti, I think, is the only country that it uses mushrooms
Oh.
in its native cuisine, which
Oh.
tells you something about the kind of colonization,
Yes.
the rest of the territories, and the depths of Haiti. So jonjon rice, which is a black mushroom rice. But last year, our other friend, Carlos Charles, came, who's from the north of Haiti, and he brought a dish called pâté, which is not related to French pâté, but
Oh.
is similar to Jamaican patties.
Oh.
Because of course, there are also these workers moving from Haiti to Cuba.
Right.
Israel's made a documentary about Haitians in Cuba, but then Jamaican workers going to Haiti. And so that it was like a somewhat related to a Jamaican patty, which of course has roots, you might think, in Cornwall or something.
England.
Yeah. But it
Yeah.
was stuffed with codfish, which is the thing that we all eat, right? The
Ah.
salted cod bacalao,
Yeah,
mohi,
bacala.
saltfish in Trinidad,
Yes.
which is so much of the thing. And then somebody else brought akras,
Uh-huh.
which
Right.
it was a Barbadian, and they call it fish cake. But of course,
Right.
Accra in Trinidad, which is saltfish cake, Accra in the Francophone world, and I think it must be related to acarajé from Brazil, right? Again, all those overlapping food worlds.
Wow. The internationalism is amazing.
And Kalaloo, you mentioned
Yes.
West Africa, you know,
Yes.
Ghana and Nigeria, okra soup and
Yes. So, on any given day, how do you divide up your time between writing and filmmaking and teaching and distributing your films? How does a day in Richard Fung's life look?
they get all mashed up like a callaloo, which is why I was thinking about this interview every day. And I was talking to my partner saying, I'm doing this interview tomorrow morning. I have to go on early. And then I get into this swamp of, you know, the Toronto Film Festival, which
Yes.
doing the Toronto Palestine Film Festival, of which I'm an advisor. I'm going to be a quote unquote distinguished visitor of the University of Toronto. So I'm teaching classes there.
Yes.
And dealing with the festivals and my new film and figuring out screenings in the States because it's showing at BAM in New York
Brooklyn,
in
yeah.
October and then Brown the next week. So I'm dealing the visa, not the visa, the payment requirements at some universities is quite astounding.
What do you mean payment requirements?
Well, you have to fill out these forms. Like I have to fill out a form as to how many days of every year I've spent in the United States since 1986.
Right.
Things like that. So
Yes, I see. But that callaloo of work, to me, it seems for most filmmakers that I've spoken to, especially if you're more on the art side and the documentary side, but that mixture of sort of cobbling it together, you know,
One
is
has to be a multitasker for sure.
yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes. They say that you're supposed to focus on doing one thing at a time, and I'm like, well, what would that be like? You know, I have no idea. I have no
The
idea.
range, I mean, we talk about filmmaking, but the range of
Yeah.
filmmakers from
Mm.
people who are working, you know, one of my friends is an international experimental star, right? I mean,
Wow.
they've built retrospectives of the work all over the world, but he's struggling.
Oh, is that
Oh, you should. Mike
Yes.
Holboom, someone else whose work is amazing.
Mike Ho?
Holboom is a Dutch name, Hoolboom.
Okay.
You know, again, the producer reports don't really bring back
No.
that much, right? And even I
What
was
do you
shocked.
mean by a producer report? Because
Oh,
you said
when your distributor usually twice
yes,
a year sends you a bunch of money and
yes,
says, these are the places that have bought your work, or this is
right,
where your work has screened and this is what it's made. They don't, I mean, they're not really a sustainable income for most independent makers. I mean, people who get into the industry, and I think that's one way. I think to survive, I taught, and it does give you time off. Sometimes, although I realize now that I'm retired, how that schedule of teaching also produced it massaged my career in particular directions and
yes,
with particular constraints. The other
yes,
thing that people do, if they can do it, is have a mixture of some industry work and
right,
then some independent work.
right.
So,
Yeah, the academia is one way, but it does mean there's a sort of a way of thinking about art. I always say art with a capital A, and I know what I mean by that. And so one of the things I teach with my clients is to sort of take the focus off distribution, because I think filmmakers think, oh, I'm going to make a film and then I'm going to make money in distribution. And I'm like, well, what if we raise all the money up front, so you get paid up front, and then there's much less pressure on how much the film has to provide in terms of income from distribution, because the income is coming from other places. Do you fundraise with grants and things like that as well?
I mean, we have a healthy granting system. It
Yes.
has been relatively healthy here. But what
Right.
you're saying is what I hear from my feature drama filmmaker friends, which
Yes.
is to get the money up front, and because they don't make much after it shows. I mean, I've shown a couple of times at Toronto Film Festival, for example, and they don't pay fees at all, right? So you get a lot of exposure. You're in a 300-page catalog,
Yes.
right? And a lot of attention is going to, you know, the Mike Lees of the world, and whom I
Right.
love, by the way, are the Pedro Almodovars of the world, whom I also love.
Yes.
So, you know, so it is a struggle until one breaks, and not a lot of people break. I was told that some of the most famous filmmakers from Canada don't actually make much money in the end in terms of box office sales, because that's the other thing with art cinema, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yes.
So I don't know now with things, I don't know how things like Netflix, etc., has changed the ecology that way and how people can make money. But yes, it is always a struggle.
Mhm,
And you
mhm.
do have to be committed. And the other thing that I have noticed is that at my age now, how many good filmmakers have dropped out of the business
That's right. The
because it is
financial
pushing me.
pressure
Yeah.
puts
You're
pushes
thinking
that.
about retirement and
Yes.
pensions, and
Yes.
you don't have one.
Right. What pension? I noticed today that Creative Capital announced their 2024 awards for film for critics of art critics. I don't know if you've ever applied for that.
No.
You're perfect for them.
Well,
But they fund writers, people who write about art,
yeah.
which I think is a very rare funding opportunity with Creative Capital. So are you going to make another project? You said retired a couple of times. Are you continuing to make films?
I don't know. I made the last film, the one I'm just releasing now, as a kind of blackmail. It wasn't going to get made unless I made it. I don't. You must have met. You must know Christopher Laird, right? From
I know
Trinidad.
his name.
Yeah.
I know. I've never met him.
Okay, so the new film is about Harold Sunny Ladu, who is the second Caribbean novelist published in Canada. He also his life and death. He was killed at the age of 28 after his just writing 2 novels, both of which are landmark novels. But Christopher was making first he got money from Channel 4 to make a feature and then couldn't raise the money to, realize it as drama. And then he was making a TV series on his life 20 something years ago. And then he couldn't get the money to dramatize the sequences. And so he abandoned the footage. And I couldn't stand to see those interviews abandoned. So then I made a film about his making a film that includes the archive. But the technology of film has changed so much. On the one hand, people keep talking about how accessible things are, and you can edit something on iMovie. I actually have something in a gallery in New York now that was edited on iMovie because I was stuck in Morocco in COVID.
Oh.
And all I had was a phone and an iPad, and I shot and I did a couple of films actually using that technology. But now I shot this on 4K. People are talking about, oh, I'm shooting on 8K.
Right.
It becomes increasingly distant from me. I mean, that was the thing about working in video as opposed to celluloid. There was a way that you can actually do things very quickly. You can see what you shot. You didn't have to wait for it to come back.
Right.
And now, with things shot in like in 8K, you can't see it. Everything's shot flat, so it has to go through a process before you can see what the color can look like.
Wow.
The DCPs, my distributor can't even see the DCPs, that they're distributing. It's all become very distant, and
interesting.
I mean, I might in the future be tempted to do something like an installation, which I haven't made in a while. I was doing installations in art when I was teaching in art school. Again, that's one of the ways I did massage my careers. I started doing video installations and projections. But yeah, I feel, and also the distribution, way things are distributed, and the way film festivals work, etc. I'm a little bit far from that now. I just saw the new film by Erice, who did The Spirit of the Beehive, which is often considered the greatest Spanish film ever, and he made a new film at the age of 84. I don't think I'm going to be him.
My friend Sergio Hiral, I don't know if you ever met Sergio Hiral, African.
Oh, no. Well, no, I know who he is for sure.
Yes. He just died in February. He was 87.
Wow.
We were always cooking up more projects to make. Oh, yeah. In fact, the one time I went to TIFF, I was there with Sergio, and one of the most wonderful people I've ever known.
Well, his work is amazing.
Yeah.
But I was saying that I studied Spanish in university, and well, in Trinidad we have to learn French and Spanish from the time we're school children, right? But it's never really perfected, and I have trouble often understanding films in Spanish when people are not speaking to me, because they're often speaking very quickly and speaking to each other and speaking in slang. But the Erice film, I understood like 90% of it. And then it occurred to me, maybe because he's 84, everybody had to speak really clearly so you can understand what they were saying. So maybe that's why I could understand it, because it was meant for
Well, I'm glad to have a film recommendation.
It's called Close Your Eyes. Cerrar los ojos. It's a lovely film, actually, and it's about cinema.
Oh, fabulous.
It's about a film that was lost.
I just want to thank you so much, Richard. I'm so glad that we finally got to talk again. And one day I will plan on being at one of your potlucks.
Yeah, do. And you have to bring something, though.
I will bring my keto version of curry chicken.
Good. Lovely.
And
Thanks.
enjoy TIFF. One of my clients is going to TIFF. He's very anxious.
He's
but
on
I-
the film? He has a film.
No.
Oh,
He's-
okay.
He's an actor more,
It's
but
become so huge. You know, I used to write about TIFF. I was just reminiscing where you would be, all the journalists and the filmmakers were in the same lounge. So you'd be
Oh.
riding the elevator with like,
Right.
you know, John Sayles, and everybody would be right there.
oh wow, John
How it's
Sayles,
changed.
my favorite. Yeah, I've only been once, and it was years ago, and the catalog was that thick.
Yes.
What I
So,
remember. So I got to get back. Next year I'll be there, and
Yeah.
I'll bring curry chicken.
okay, good.
Lovely,
go.
Richard. Thank you so much. And
Thanks so much
we'll
for
be in
inviting
touch.
me.
Bye-bye. Thank
Bye-bye.
you.